This is Zach Edwards with another episode of the Adventure Box podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a great time to talk about ancient Israel. So, again, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tuesday, if you missed it, we talked about Jacob. Now, what's interesting, again, biblical, but also historical. You need to be able to understand the history behind the Israelites in order to appreciate who they were and what they went through. Also, remember, Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes. Again, the 12 tribes of Israel. Also very important, because when the Assyrians come into the kingdom of Israel, not the kingdom of Judah, and the tribes all broke apart. So you had the 10 tribes of Israel living in the kingdom of Israel, and the Assyrians took them and spread them out throughout the whole Assyrian empire, forced them to move out and to repopulate other places, so there was no chance of rebellion. And there wasn't for those of Judah. One second. Sorry about that. Okay. So this is why it's so important to understand the origins of every single civilization. To be able to understand what happened to them and where they went and where they are today, you have to be able to understand where they came from. Now, today we're going to be talking about something that's very important for not just the biblical retelling of the ancient Israelite studies, but also the Egyptians talk about it, and also, so biblical being the Christian retelling, the, Judaism, or the Jews retelling their history, and also Egypt telling the history. Now, we talked about this last week. We're going to talk about it again. When Joseph was sold into Egypt, remember, that was his brothers. His 10 brothers took him and were jealous with him, took him, sold him to some nomadic traders. So those traders walked into Egypt and sold Joseph. They then went back to Jacob, who we talked about last week, Tuesday, and said, "Your son is dead," and gave him a coat that he was wearing with blood splattered all over it. And all of a sudden, Jacob thinks that his line through Rachel, his wife, his beloved wife, is now gone. Rachel's able to have one more kid, and then she dies in childbirth. Meaning there's one child that's going to bring on the bloodline of Rachel and Jacob. Very substantial, very significant during that time. Okay, so now you have Jacob, Joseph, who is in Egypt. And as soon as a famine happens, the 10 brothers come down into Egypt. Not with their 11th brother, not with Benjamin, who was born through Rachel. Jacob does not want to lose him. Jacob is now called Israel. Jacob does not want to lose him, so the 10 sons go down there into Egypt to buy grain to feed their family. And guess who's there? Joseph's there. Joseph set some traps for them just to check out who they were, what they were doing. He knew who they were, but who were they now? Were they going to, were they the same people that sold him into slavery and such? So then he basically, everything's figured out within the family. He moves his family in. So this is when the Israelites come in. This is also when the Hyksos are being said by the Egyptians to have invaded the country. But how did they invade the country? They simply migrated in. And actually, because it's a country, they immigrated in. So there's a difference. There's migration, which is traveling within your own country, and there's immigration. Now, if you have laws for either one of those, you're supposed to obey those laws. So the migrant is a person that's traveling within their own country. An immigrant is a person that's traveling from one country to another, and maybe to like 5 other countries. But they're immigrating, which means they're enveloping. They are immersing themselves in that country, that nation, that civilization. Now, Egypt, it probably had some laws. I actually don't know. I don't know if anyone knows. I'd have to look that up. Maybe you should look it up. But they probably had laws where they said you couldn't travel in except for X, Y, or Z for these reasons. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe this is the reason they should have had that. because they didn't, they had the Hyksos, the foreigners, who were Canaanites and those from the Levant. They traveled from Canaan and Levant, and actually, I think as far as Syria, into Egypt and started setting up camps. So they started moving their civilization over there when what was happening? Probably a famine. They couldn't find food. They moved to where the food was. What was happening in Egypt? Remember, the Lower Egyptian area, Lower Egypt kingdom, the kingdom of Lower Egypt, is actually very flush with agriculture. It's very moist. The ground's very fertile. So what happens? You get a lot of people coming in and setting up shop and putting up their farms and taking some of the resources. Well, the Egyptians didn't like this. They were up in the upper kingdom. And so they basically started turning on the Hyksos. Now, we're talking about hundreds of years. So let's go through some of these dates. Let's see. First off, I'm going to show you a map of the area. So they came as far as Syria, Jordan, Israel, over to Cairo, and Lower Egypt, which is all this green spot next to Egypt, where the water flows down the Nile and out into the Mediterranean. So you have the Egyptians here. You have the Hyksos, the invaders, right here. The Hyksos continue to migrate in. Without, I'm guessing if it's over a few hundred years, it didn't happen all at once, for one thing. It also must not have been too much of a imposition of the Egyptians until it was too late and there's too many of them. I don't know what's going on with my throat today, but I keep getting all these little tickles. Anyways, let's go back to the story. So you have, oops, let's get rid of that. Okay. So you have Joseph in Egypt. His family comes down. You have Jacob that dies. Then what happens? Okay, so this is around 1870 is when Joseph comes in and then moves his family in, about 1876 BC. And then between then and 1650 is when the Hyksos all start coming in. There was probably a little bit there before. There was probably a lot of them came afterwards. The Hyksos then rise in power around 1650. So they established control over the Egyptian area during the Second Intermediate Period. Now, why is this significant? Because an intermediate period in Egypt was when the government was basically falling apart. The Egyptian government was falling apart. The Hyksos could easily take over power because there was no real rule there. There was so much opposition. Usually it happens because of internal squabbles where they're fighting each other. So the Hyksos rise in power. And they stay in power, again, between 1800, most likely around 1650 is when they were the peak of their strength, until 1550. And this is when Pharaoh Ahmose, and actually his father started it, his brother took over it, and then he's the one that finished it. He defeated the Hyksos and pushed some of them out. This is when the new kingdom came. One second, my throat is really starting to tickle a lot. One second. Okay, there's one good thing about having a tickle in your throat and trying to get rid of it. You drink a lot of water. So I'm downing this jug. So I got this massive jug. This is where I'm supposed to be at each hour of the day. And yes, this is a little rant. It's a little off, but I want to share this with you. So 9 o'clock, I'm supposed to be starting the water. And by 9 o'clock p.m., I'm supposed to be done with the water. It's at 128. 128? It is 200. No. 1,800 milliliters. Sorry, it's 64 ounces. Yeah, I was going to say, that didn't look like 128. 64 ounces. You can actually do 2 of these in a day. But when all of a sudden you get a tickle in your throat and you're on a podcast, you're going to down that water trying to get that tickle out of the throat. Because it does not work very well. Okay, now back to my story. So you have the Hyksos all coming in, setting up shop. This is where they want to be. This is where they want to live. Then all of a sudden you have Pharaoh Ahmose and his family, those before him, go from the upper Egyptian area down the Nile into Lower Egypt and fight the Hyksos to expel them. And they expel a ton of them. But do they expel them all? There's no record of how many they expelled or taking them as slaves. But we know that they did. They took people as slaves. Now, if you look at their descriptions, you can actually see multicolored slaves. Some were white, some were brown, some were black. Most, not really black much, because they, oh no, they did. Oh man, this is going to be horrible for my podcast. 1 second. I think I was just drinking during that during that time when I said, wait a second. And I had a really loud, I'm going to have to edit that out. Okay. Anyways, so I'm going to put an X up, and hopefully I remember to cut this out. Okay. So the Ahmose comes in, expels a lot of them, enslaves a good amount of them. And what do? They start building. They start building and building and building for the Egyptians. So they're all over the place. And they enslave them from about 1550 until about 13 to 11 BC. Now, the reason, not 1100 BC. The reason why we don't know is because we don't know exactly which pharaoh it was that expelled them, that released them from their service. So, now, I didn't check this out, but I'm going to check this out right now. When was King Ramses, Pharaoh, the second, Ramses the second in power? Okay, here we go. So, what is Google telling me? Ramses II was in power about 1259 BC to about 1213 BC. Now, this is actually where a lot of historians think they may have been expelled or released. So, because this is near the end of Ramses' reign, and during this time, he went from bumper crops, building everywhere, everything's amazing for him, into a almost failing economy, and a lot of his construction stops. So this is why it makes sense that if all of a sudden 2 million slaves, 2 million of those from Canaan leave Egypt, that this would happen, that the economy would tank. Ramses was the one where the economy tanked. So I actually think, me personally, doing all this research and stuff, I would actually say it was closer to 1220 to 1213. This is near the end of Ramses II's reign. You could say of terror or whatnot. He was actually one of them that lived till about around beginning or mid 90s. So he lived for a long time. He reigned for 66 years. Okay, so let's keep going. So during this time, they are captured. They do work for the Egyptians. And before Moses or so, before the Exodus that happens, and we'll talk about that on Monday, before that time, you have a lot of construction happening all over Egypt. Some of the major construction of all buildings, including, what was their, I'm trying to remember. It's their major city, their major capital that they do. I can't think it offhand, and I don't have it in my notes. But they are said to have built that during this time. Now, as you can see, the Nile, if you're looking at the video, you're going to see that the Nile is green all the way up and down this. This is Lower Egypt. All these different cities. The Hyksos came in, and then they were expelled. This is Upper Egypt. Still green, still lush. Still a lot of cities and such. I've always wanted to go to Egypt. As of right now, I don't think it's the safest to go to Egypt, but at some point, I would like to go. Now, they're saying that the Exodus was somewhere around, some people would say that the Exodus is about 1400 BC. Between 1400 and 1220, that's about the same time. That's about the time when it happened. No one has records of it. Now, here's the thing that you have to understand. When a new emperor, when a new leader comes in, especially during the olden times when not everyone had the written text or could even read the written text, the ruler would come in. Let's just take Aztecs. The Aztecs were actually Mayans. Mayans were the biggest ones when it comes to this. They had what we call the codexes. The Aztec codexes were written history, written religious documents, and also economic documents of what was happening during that time. There were only certain people or certain scribes that could read it. Some of the leaders were taught how to read it, but it went down by the scribes. So who was actually in charge? Well, the scribes were to some extent because they remembered everything. But the Mayans, when they had a new person come in as a leader, they would destroy a lot of the old codexes unless they were preserved, hidden away. They would destroy the old codexes and create their own new ones with new religions, new history. What happens when somebody wants to take you over? If you're a civilization, somebody wants to take you over, they do two things besides military force and taking you over. First thing they do, in order for you to assimilate into what they want, they indoctrinate. Indoctrination is basically when you you're told what is going on, and you, because you hear it so much, you start to believe it. You're being indoctrinated. They're giving you doctrine, whether it's religious, historical, ethical, moral, whatever. They can indoctrinate you to doing it. Now, this is not where they teach you like a parent would do. Indoctrination is more of something that they don't control your everyday life, or they're not around your everyday life, but they tell you certain snippets over time. Take World War II. The Germans had a lot of indoctrination put together by Hitler. Why did he want to burn the books? Oh, wait a second, there's a codex. Burn the books, replace the history. Perfect example of it. I should have thought of that. Just popped in my head. What was he doing? It wasn't that he didn't want people to read. No. He didn't want people to have ideas that were spurred from history. People that don't want to teach you history, that's a little bit of the same thing, minus the burning of the books or changing the codexes. This is trying to teach you what they want you to believe, because they won't teach you what actually happened in history or what other people are teaching. This is like when we're talking about ancient Israel. We're talking about the Quran. It's not biblical. It's not a Christian. It's not a Judaism, a Jewish source. No, it's a Muslim source, which is completely different. It's still a religion, still a religious document, but completely we're at like odds with the Jews. So you have all these different things that are going on during this time. In order for someone to take over, they have to take over your brain as well, your mind, and turn your mind basically to what they believe or want you to believe. Why else do they want you to do this? Because it's less chances that you will rebel. If all of a sudden someone tells you a lie, and they tell you this over and over and over again, you start believing it, how are they going to make sure that that stays that way and that you'll stay a supporter of them? Well, they will indoctrinate. They will change the history, but then they will try to feed you things that make you feel, yeah, we need to do this, yeah. They want you to feel empowered by this new source of information. And sorry to say it, Hitler Youth, indoctrination. What Hitler was trying to do with burning the books, indoctrination. They don't want free thinking. Those that don't want you to free think, indoctrination. Most of them are back to indoctrination. So I've always lived in a culture, and my family, who wants me to read everything and anything, because if they can teach me in the right way, I will understand for myself how to live my life based on what I've learned, but also be able to understand where these things are coming from. So they don't want to be cut and dry saying, this is what you should believe. This is what you should believe. This is what you should believe. Instead, there's like, this is what we believe, and will teach me that. And then they'll teach me, but you need to find out for yourself. And you will learn all these different things. Now, when the Pharaoh comes in, we're going back to the Egyptians and the Israelites. When the Pharaoh comes in, the new Pharaoh, he doesn't know, and this is what it says in the Bible, the Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Pharaoh did not know Joseph because, one, the Pharaoh that Joseph knew could have been Hyksos. And so all of a sudden, this new Pharaoh comes in from Upper Egypt. He wouldn't know Joseph. Who's Joseph? Who's this guy? I have no clue who this guy is. No. Not doing it. So taking the people captive, he didn't know Joseph. So he takes them captive. But what happens? A lot of times, two things happen. One, he'll originate by rewriting history. But then, if something happens he doesn't like, he'll rewrite history again and again and again, as many times as he needs to, in order to make sure that what he wants in his legacy is written and ready for everyone else to obey and listen to. So, you have Egypt, who doesn't have straight, direct information on the Israelites, except for it does have some stelas that say Israelites, and those from Canaan, but we already know the Hyksos were from Canaan. So what do? You rewrite history. What happens if all of a sudden you make a decree to kill all the children of the Jews or the Hebrews in your land? Would you want that in writing? Heck no. I wouldn't want anyone to know what I did to do that. Especially because, remember, the Egyptians believed in an afterlife. They believed in not redemption. Exaltation, which means to become like God. They believed in exaltation. In order to do that, your heart is weighed with the characteristics of God. And if it's not equal, if the characteristics of God, well, let's see, I don't know how it would be. Would it be heavier? Which one would be an evil heart or the characteristics of God? We'll say the evil heart is heavier. So if it's out of balance, you do not get exalted. As a pharaoh, if you are not seen as balanced, you are not exalted. You are not made like a god. Sorry, you're not. So what do? You try to change history to match what you want it to be. And they also put those documents in a lot of the crypts where they buried the Egyptians. They have all their writings in there. This proves I was a great person in the real world. You have to believe me. Well, sorry, I don't think God is that dumb. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't say that way. I don't think God is that misguided. I think he would understand. I mean, if there's a God in the afterlife, he will understand who you are better than you probably do. And so there you go. According to the Egyptians, they wanted to be looked at in grand thoughts. So if you did something as, I would say, evil and malicious as killing off babies, yeah, that would not be seen pretty high by their own God. So at this point, the Pharaoh rewrites history, and we don't have the history that's there. So for those that don't want to listen to the Bible, or don't want to read the Bible as a historical document, sorry to tell you, everything in history can be altered, can be changed, has probably been changed multiple times. This is why we have to mix history and written documents with archaeology and what we find in archaeology. And then we still don't even know if it's true. But we do the best that we can. But if we're going to do that, we have to accept that the Bible actually might have historical information that we need to be able to accept. You don't have to accept the religious part, but you do have to be able to accept the historical part. Okay, enough said. Tuesday, we will be talking about the Exodus. Now, the Exodus is fascinating. Not just by the miracles, but by the actual history of what happens, what they do from that point. We're going to go to that on Tuesday. Now, again, this is a religious text. It is written by a religious people. So please don't discount it just because it's written on a religious text. Listen to it. Learn from it. We're going to teach you some things that are very fascinating next week. So stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have questions, please put them in the comments. Ask us any question you might have. We would love to answer them for you and give you back answers, which we will do on screen and give you a shout out. So thanks so much for joining us. We will catch you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.